church history is full of an incredible cast of really interesting and diverse characters. But in my opinion, perhaps no figures are more exciting, interesting, and challenging in all the right ways than the Desert Fathers. Perhaps you've heard of them. So in the 3rd century, a movement starts with Paul of Thebes, and he goes out to the desert to seek solitude, silence, and to cultivate prayer. Now, originally, the movement of the Desert Fathers, and this is happening in Egypt primarily at this time, it starts as at times seeking solitude, but also seeking safety away from persecution. It's the 3rd century here, which towards the end of it and at the beginning of the 4th, we would get some of the most fierce persecutions, especially under Diocletian. So some Christians are fleeing to the desert literally for their lives, while others are doing so for their spiritual lives, right? To deepen their intimacy with God. But then later, something really interesting is going to happen, that with the Edict of Milan, where we have tolerance for Christianity, and then you have Emperor Constantine kind of favoring Christianity, kind of converting. That's all kind of a messy story. But what happens pretty quickly in the 4th century is that Christianity becomes mainstream. And all of a sudden, all these people are becoming Christians. And now people start fleeing to the desert, but for an entirely new reason. Instead of fleeing persecution, people are fleeing the kind of ease of Christianity, because Christianity had become something that you could do not to kind of not in spite of persecution. It wasn't something that you had to do through great trial and tribulation, but it was actually something that could help you gain status. And all of a sudden, there's this influx of converts, and people are saying, no, we need to find the purity of the faith again. And so they now start going out to the desert. And you have some really famous figures that you might have heard from the desert, like St. Anthony, he's the most famous desert father, but then you have Macarius, Abba Moses. You have some desert mothers, like Amma Syncletica, and a few others. But anyway, I find these characters absolutely fascinating. And you can find their works and their lives. There's the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, which is a collection of their works, and the Lives of the Desert Fathers, as well as works that kind of go just into one or two fathers. But I selfishly want to tell you about something that I'm really excited about. So you might know that for my patrons, I do book clubs where we read through the church fathers together. It's honestly one of my favorite parts about having this channel, because I get to sit down virtually with people from all over the world and all across the Christian tradition to discuss the best texts that the Christian tradition has ever created, right? And so we've read the Ante-Nicene Fathers, we've read St. Basil, we've read Tertullian and Cyprian, and Origen, and we've read St. Gregory the Great, and so many others. We've gone through like 7 or 8 books at this point, but we're getting ready to go through the Desert Fathers together. And in this video, I'm going to talk about what I've learned from the Desert Fathers, but I trust I'm going to learn so much more and getting to read through these works in community with others, because that's when these texts, no matter what text it is, really come to life. If you've ever been part of a great book club, you know that you had one perspective going into it, but then getting to hear from all of these other people who have their own experiences and insights that they bring to the text allows you to get so much more out of it. So I'm really looking forward to reading through the Desert Fathers this spring and then into the beginning of summer with this group. And if you want to join, you can join for as little as $5 a month at patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. But without further ado, here are a few things that I've learned from the Desert Fathers to just kind of commend them to you. So the first thing is what it means to go deep in your faith. Oftentimes you hear people in church say, I just want to go deep. And what they often mean is that they want to learn more theology. And that's great, right? I'm a theology nerd. I have that printed on apparel, which you can get at gospelsimplicity.com. But that wasn't even meant to be a plug. Anyway, people often mean by going deep that they just want to learn a lot of stuff. And that's great. And I hope that on this channel you learn a lot of stuff. But that's really not what I think going deep in the faith means. And the Desert Fathers point this out really well. You see, there was a practice in the desert at this time of giving a word to followers. And so what this means is you'd have a leader of a monastic community. And because, just a side point, originally many of the Desert Fathers went out seeking solitude, and some continued that way. But then you have this fancy word incoming form of monasticism called cenobitic monasticism arise, which is communal monasticism. And so often you'd have communities around a spiritual father or spiritual mother. More on that later. But these people would come seeking advice from the spiritual father, and what would often happen is they would ask for a word. And this isn't that they would sit and teach them for hours, but they would give them one single teaching and tell them to not come back for more until they lived that out. And I think that's so important. I remember sitting down with a pastor one day and him saying, like, if people lived out just one sermon a year for the whole year, they would get so much out of it. It would change their life. But the problem is that people sit through 52 of them, right? But they don't actually implement any of them. And I think now we've kind of multiplied that in a whole new way. If you're anything like me, you probably devour online content. And I know that in this new year, that's something I need to work on, right? And of course, cue the irony of talking about that in a YouTube video. But so often we inundate ourselves with ideas and think that they're going to change our life through osmosis, right? If we just get all the right inputs in our ears, somehow that will work out in our life. But it really doesn't. And so the Desert Fathers do such a good job in the way they model this through giving a single word, like someone coming to you and saying, don't judge your neighbor. Don't come back to me till you figured that out. And my challenge to you, as you read the Desert Fathers or as you just go throughout your spiritual life this year, what would it look like to have that approach where you're not looking for more ideas, but you're really looking to master one or two teachings? Maybe you want to go deep in prayer and you're going to stick with one devotional practice. Maybe that's the Jesus prayer. Maybe you're into the Divine Mercy Chaplet, or you want to pray the Psalms, or whatever it is. But stick to that. It's perseverance. It's continuing to do the thing, which the Desert Fathers are so good at, and they're kind of the way they modeled this in their teaching is absolutely wonderful. The second thing, and this actually comes out of that first point, is the importance of humility and the centrality of non-judgment. These two ideas really go together. If you read the Desert Fathers, they're idiosyncratic, they're full of interesting backstories and sayings, and they'll boggle your mind. They defy systemization. But one thing that is a real through line through most of the Desert Fathers' teaching is that of humility and not judging others. They often will say that I am the worst of sinners, right? Following Paul in this. And who am I, therefore, to judge? Abba Moses is probably my favorite. Abba means father, by the way. Abba Moses is probably my favorite figure for this. And there's this great story from his life in which a brother has been caught in sin. And so they're calling the brothers together to kind of figure out what to do with this, right? So they're living in communities. There's been a breach of the conduct. So what are we to do? And Abba Moses initially refuses. Now, Abba Moses has a really fascinating story. He's also known as Saint Moses the Black. He was initially a robber and then eventually becomes a monk through a kind of story there. And he is constantly aware of the fact that he has lived this very sinful life, and that in some ways he's still that person, even though he's radically transformed his life. And so when they tell him to come, he says, no, who am I to judge? I can't judge. They're like, no, we need you. Like, you're a leader in this community. You've got to come here. And so finally he takes a leaking bucket and pours water in it and walks to it. And they notice, hey, you're leaking water. Like, Abba Moses, what are you doing? And he says, these are my sins dripping out behind me as I walk to go and judge my brother. And they all decided at that, okay, we're going to dissolve the meeting because Abba Moses is right. We are not here to judge. It's such a beautiful teaching. And to me, this idea of non-judgment is something that Christians can really use today. Now, we often struggle with kind of weighing like discernment and judgment. And how are those things different? And I get it. But I think in our internet culture, especially of dunking on people, of showing how we're right, of virtue signaling and all of that, we could really do with a dose of the Desert Fathers and their way in which they tell us to focus on ourselves before we go out and judge others. The third thing I want to talk about that I've learned from the Desert Fathers is the need for silence and solitude. This is huge. Now, if you're an introvert like me, you might think, okay, that's easy. And in many ways, it might be for you. It might be easier. But I think the way in which, just through their example of going out and seeking to find God in the desert, reminds us that we need to slow down. You see, we're often alone today, but that doesn't mean we're actually seeking solitude. Solitude is seeking intentional quiet with God, right? It's not just being away from people, but it's going away from people to be with God for a purpose. And so often today, we might kind of distance ourselves from people. And actually, I think we have a loneliness problem, but yet we lack solitude, because we have so many thoughts whirring through our head. We have AirPods constantly in our ears. We have books in our hands. We're always trying to learn and do this and do the next thing. And sometimes we just need to learn to slow down and find God in the silence. Another story from the life of Abba Moses, that of Abba Isidore coming to him and telling him, everything you need to learn, you can learn by sitting in your cell. And the cell would be where they'd live, just sitting quietly. Of course, Blaise Pascal has this kind of similar line, right? That's often talked about, that all of modern man's problems is that he can't sit silently in a room by himself. And I'd really challenge you this year. Maybe this is something you need to work on. What would it look like to start the day? Just give yourself 5 minutes where you sit in silence. No, not even a kind of reading to do, not a conscious devotion you're doing, but just to sit in silence, trying to be there in the presence of God. Try it. I think you'll find it to be quite transformative. And I'd encourage you to then try to scale that up. Something that's been really helpful for Eliza and I is trying to implement this in small ways in our daily life, but then having rhythms and routines where at a monthly level, we can have kind of a day of solitude, right? So we might go to a beautiful cathedral. We're blessed to be near a lot of those, where we can just sit for the morning, and we will take maybe some prayer beads. There's some that have like crypt chapels that we'll go to, and we'll just be there in silence for a while. And then we can go and debrief afterwards and talk about, what came up for us in that time. And then more like quarterly, or slightly less than quarter, or more, whatever would be more time, we try to plan like solitude retreats, whether that's going to a monastery or going camping or something like that, but intentional times of being in stillness and silence with God. In our frenetic-paced world, this has been something that's been transformative for us. I should say there's also, at the weekly level, taking that time of Sabbath, right? This all kind of goes in together to find that time of quiet and rest. For us, that looks like on Sundays, completely unplugging, having no tech, which, with being terrible with directions, keeps you from going very far, right? And allows you to slow down. It's been the most life-giving practice for us, and I hope you might find that as well. Fourth, this is going to seem like the inverse of what I just said, but I actually think these two things go together. And that is the importance of community. The Desert Fathers found very quickly that while many had gone to live by themselves, and the life of St. Anthony the Great is so wonderful for this, right? Like, he goes to the desert by himself, and then constantly people keep following him, and then he goes further, and then they follow him, and he goes further, and they follow him, right? And he has these times where he lives for a while by himself, but then he also lives in community. And I think so many of us, we lack meaningful community. And maybe that's something that you really need this year. As I'm saying this year because I'm recording this on New Year's Day, I think the Desert Fathers show us that seeking God and even seeking silence and solitude doesn't mean that we no longer need people. In fact, we need wise people, like a spiritual father who can lead us in the way. And we also need our brothers and sisters to encourage us on the journey. Because being a Christian at any time can be really hard. And living life can be difficult, right? And man wasn't meant to be alone, right? That's the first bad thing we see in Genesis, in the creation story there. And so I hope that maybe an encouragement for you is that even these great ascetics recognized that they needed one another, and that that's often the means that God would use for them to grow. Number 5, I want to talk about the effect of swimming upstream. So the Desert Fathers, as we talked about, especially as the movement grows and really flowers into the 4th century, and even beyond that, they saw that culture was going one way, and even the church, right? That it was becoming a church of the rich. It was becoming a church that had gone from the persecuted to the powerful, from the poor to the rich, right? From the outskirts to the center. And they said, we need to do something different. And that's what they did. They went out to the desert to model a different way. I think the church at its best is always seeking to do this. Instead of trying to conform ourselves to the culture, we should look for ways in which we can speak meaningfully, but not even necessarily speak with our actions by doing something different. For instance, today we have such a pursuit of wealth and status. What would it look like for Christians in a very similar way to the Desert Fathers to say, instead of zigging where everyone else is zigging, what if we zagged, right? When everyone else is trying to have more and more and more, what if we had less? What if in a time when people often kind of isolate themselves and just go home and watch Netflix, we actually chose to live in intentional communities? What if when people have kind of the frenetic pace of the world and are always adding things to their schedule and always answer, how you doing, busy, we said, actually, I'm at peace because I'm learning to live with margin, right? What if when everyone's looking for kind of crazy, unhinged sexualities, we said, actually, we're going to be people of fidelity. There's so many different ways that we could look at this, right? But I think it's important to look for that sense of where can we choose to be intentionally radical and different? Because this is really where spiritual authority comes from. The church, it loses its voice when it just becomes part of the greater cacophony of the culture. But the church can have a distinct voice when it stands apart as a city on a hill, as a community set apart for God. But we can't just do that in our head and have ideas and just write treatises on this or make YouTube videos, right? We actually have to do that in our lives. We have to be different. We have to live different. And what's amazing to me is that the Desert Fathers never should have had influence, right? Most of these people never wrote anything down. They went away from kind of the centers of culture, whether that be Rome or Alexandria, and instead they went out into the deserts and lived poor lives, weaving baskets just to make enough to have food, right? And yet, here we are talking about them nearly 2,000 years later. If you go into the Orthodox tradition, you'll find that these figures are still some of the most influential people in the tradition. Indeed, some of the most influential theologians without ever intending to be theologians in the way that we conceive of that today. If we want to make a lasting impact, it's not through doing what everyone else is doing. It's not necessarily even through pursuing the usual paths of greatness. It's through seeking to be faithful in the context that God has called us to be faithful in, even when that looks very different than might be what we might expect. And the last thing I want to talk about is the role of our desires. Now, just like humility, I think desire and humility kind of bookend the Desert Fathers for me, because on the one hand, you always see them talking about humility and non-judgment, and the other hand, they're always battling with their passions. And at the core of our passions are our desires, right? Augustine talks about sin as disordered desire, which I think is really helpful. Not that desire in itself is necessarily bad, but we latch our desire onto the wrong things and we're constantly feeding it in unhealthy ways. Amma Syncletica has this great saying where she says, "Do not fill yourselves with bread and you will not desire wine." Now, on the one hand, you could say that this is just like a teaching on fasting, right? But I think it's actually much deeper than that. She's telling us to be careful the way in which we fulfill our kind of regular desires, because that's going to latch onto more excessive desires. We have to be really careful about always indulging ourselves. We're taught to always treat ourselves and give ourselves what we want because we deserve it, right? And I'm not saying that we have to have this like crazy asceticism where we're like lashing ourselves or anything like that, but we should recognize desire as appetite, these passions as things that when we feed them, they grow, and learn how to strategically make sure that we don't let them get out of hand. Now, that often starts with the stomach, right? That's why fasting is such a central discipline to the church, but it can be all types of other things. It could be with our screen time. It could be with how we kind of satisfy our just trivial desires to not be bored, right? How do we learn to be very kind of strict with ourselves, to be aware of our desires in the small things so that we don't allow them to get out of hand in the big things? Now, these are just 6 things that I've learned from the Desert Fathers. There's so much more that I could talk about, but what I really hope is that we get to learn together from them. So again, this group is going to be starting in the middle of January, but the Desert Fathers and the way we're going to go through them really allows you to kind of jump in whenever you want, because it's not a text like others where you have to read it straight through. We're going to be focusing on different figures throughout this, and I'm so looking forward to it. I would love to have you there. Again, to join that group, you can go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. Sign up at any tier. You become part of the book club. We meet every other week, and the readings will be super manageable since the Desert Fathers aren't necessarily these copious writers, right? It's just their sayings. Anyway, thanks so much for listening to this, and God bless.